Hello, dear friends. I would like to talk today about parashat Behukotai, which is the end of the book of Leviticus, and it's also the portion that has to do with the blessings and the curses. Now, there's a very unusual approach to this. One of them is Nachmanides, who claims that, as we know, there are two places in the Torah where you have blessings and curses. One is in Leviticus, chapter 27, which is Parashat Behukotai, and the other place is in Deuteronomy, Devarim, chapter 28, where also you have blessings and curses. Nachmanides says that this week's Parashat Behukotai in Vayikra is referring to the destruction of the first temple and the 70 years of the Babylonian exile, and that's why it says, therefore shall the land make up for the sabbaticals that were not kept, meaning the 10 sabbaticals that were not kept, and therefore there are 70 years of exile in Babylonia. Whereas in Deuteronomy and Devarim, it refers to the destruction of the second temple and the long exile which comes after that. But there's a very unusual verse in our Parsha in Vayikra. And it says, "V'hashimoti ani et haaretz," which literally means, "I will make the land desolate." Hashimoti is like desolation, and Hashimoti ani et haaretz, I shall make the land shomema, which is like a desert, desolate. V'shamamu ala oivechem yoshvim ba, which could mean one of two things. Meaning your enemies shall be desolate when they're there too, meaning they won't be able to build anything, or your enemies shall be astonished at how desolate the land is. Now, it also could be a double entendre, mean both, because basically it is the same root. Shamamu, like the word Hashimoti, means, Hashimoti in that sense means desolation. Shamamu can mean desolation, from the word shamama, and it can be astonishment from the word lihishtomeh. So what does this mean? So Rashi interprets it like this. He says, Zo midat tova liYisrael. This is actually a good omen, or it's a good idea, or a good sign for the Jewish people, in the sense that the nations will try to build up the land, but will be unsuccessful. It will constantly be in its desolation. On the next verse, Betchem ezareh b'goyim, that I shall scatter you among the nations, Rashi says that's not a good thing. Why? Because at least if you are in galut, if you're in exile, like in the Babylonian exile, you'd want to be together. But if you're going to be dispersed, it's no good. Actually, in the Babylonian exile, more or less, the Jewish communities were together. There was in Alexandria, there was in Babylonia, but more or less, you might say, in Egypt. But when Jewish communities are totally dispersed, it's much harder, of course, to create the necessary functions of the community and the needs of the community, of course, and the infrastructures of these communities. Therefore, it's not good when it says they will be scattered. But what does it mean that it's a good sign, or it's a good promise when it says that the land will remain in its devastation? Nachmanides, writing in the 13th century, says, who came to Israel in the last years of his life and died there in 1270, he quotes this Rashi, that it's a good sign for Israel that the land will remain in its devastation with our enemies there. And he says, and they are all trying to build it up, ve'en le'el yadam, but they're not even able to. No matter how much the nations try to build up this land, they're unable to do so. And in the 14th century, Rabbeinu Bachai ben Asher, who is a student of Nachmanides, he's really a student of Rabbi Shlomo ben Adret, or ben Aderet, he writes in his Perush on the Torah, also continuing the line of Nachmanides, not only they will not be able to build it up, but they won't it won't be rebuilt. Ad sheyashuvu ha'efrochim laken. It won't be built up until the birds and the chicks, the small birds, go back to their official nest. Meaning, when the Jewish people come back to the land of Israel, only then would the land of Israel be rebuilt. This idea we can also find the Talmud. The Talmud in Sanhedrin 98, 99 says in the name of Rabbi Abba, you have no better sign that the redemption is coming than this. Shene'emar, as it says in Isaiah, V'atem arei Yisrael, and you, the hills of Israel, anfechem titenu, give forth your branches, upiryechem tisu lami Yisrael, and bear your fruit to my people Israel, ki kervu lavo, because they are about to come again. It's happening very quickly. So Rabbi Abba says this is the best sign that the redemption is going to be happening, when you see the land of Israel bearing its fruit in a plentiful way, which is exactly the way Rashi interprets that remark of Rabbi Abba. So that the land will give forth its fruit, and the Jewish people will come back. Now, this is an interesting thing. It's sort of this symbiotic relationship between the land and the people. And the curse of the desolation of the land turns into a promise that it'll remain in desolation until the Jewish people come back. I want to quote you much later in history from a book written by Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain, called Innocents Abroad. At the beginning of the book, he writes that it was the 1st of February, 1867. Now, Twain had visited Europe and the Holy Land, as he writes in the beginning of the book. And when he's describing in chapter 46, the Holy Land, he talks about certain areas that he passed through. And he writes, there is not a solitary village throughout its whole extent, not for 30 miles in either direction. There are two or three small clusters of Bedouin tents, but not a single permanent habitation. One may ride 10 miles hereabouts and not see 10 human beings. To this region, one of the prophecies is applied, and he quotes from Leviticus 27, I will bring the land into desolation, and your enemies which dwell therein shall be astonished at it. And I will scatter you among the heathen, and I will draw out a sword after you, and your land shall be desolate, and your cities shall be waste. And Twain continues, no man can stand here by deserted Ein Melalaha and say the prophecy has not been fulfilled. Memalaha. So he says, basically, if you look at the land of Israel now, which of course he was going through, the Holy Land in 1867, he says basically it's a land of desolation. The Peel Committee, set up by the British in 1937, were trying to figure out how many people could be accommodated in Palestine, which was taken over by the British in 1917. Remember, Palestine at the time was Israel and Transjordan together. What's today Israel and Jordan? And the Peel Commission was wondering maybe should be split up into Israel and another nation, which eventually was Jordan. And then they talk about the transfer of Arabs, and they list 225,000 Arabs, which in their opinion should be transferred. It was more or less the amount of Arabs on this side of the Jordan River. In a census taken, by the way, in 1922, there were 750,000 inhabitants in all of Palestine, which means Israel and Transjordan. 78% were Muslims. So it makes sense what the Peel Commission writes in 1937 about that. By the way, one last census was taken by the British Mandate in 1931. In that census, there were 1,003,415 inhabitants, excluding the British soldiers, out of which 759,000 were Muslims 174,000 were Jews. And this, of course, was before Palestine was drawn up into two parts. 1946, the UNCCP had a working paper where they basically said that in all of Palestine, meaning Israel and Transjordan, there were 1,845,000 people by that point, approximately 1 million Muslims, about 600,000 Jews, 145,000 Christians, which would mean that in 1948, with the establishment of the State of Israel, in the State of Israel, there are approximately 600,000 Jews, probably 608, 600,000 Arabs, and in Jordan, there are also 600,000 Arabs, which were listed by by the Jordanians around that time, around 1950, it's 586,000. Anyhow, not going to great detail. All I want to point out is that, as the prophecy says in Vayikra, Leviticus, the land was desolate. As the Jews started coming back, people started coming to this area and started taking a renewed interest in this area, but basically there was nothing here. It was controlled by the British before that it was controlled by the Turks for about 400 years. But population, it was basically an arid, dry area. Tel Aviv was basically sand dunes. Netanya was sand dunes. All this around 1900, they were just sand dunes. There was nothing. There's a small city of Jaffa, small city of Jerusalem, which the Jews were the majority of since 1850, when you had 8,000 people of all of Jerusalem. That was the first time. At that point, the Jews had become a majority, slightly more than 4,000. And basically the whole land until the early 20th century was without people and without not only without population, without much building. It was basically sand dune and desert. So I wanted to point out that the fulfillment of this prophecy, and I think it's an important thing for us to understand, and also not to give in to all the fake news that people talk about. And it was a really real blessing, because we are the type of people who like working with the nations in our area and being able to work with them correctly. And therefore, it's good to know these things. Shalom, shalom.